Countries have constitutions, and sometimes those constitutions aren't able to deal with certain unprecedented events, like in 1861 when some US states opted to secede and make their own America, or in Belgium in 1990, when the king refused to assent to a new law and so had to be temporarily declared incapable of ruling in order to get around him and pass the law anyway. And Australia, not wanting to be left out, had its own constitutional crisis in 1975, which saw its Prime Minister abruptly fired and replaced by his opponent, all of which came alongside accusations of CIA and British Royal involvement. But was this the case, and how was it resolved? So first, a bit of background. As of 1975, Australia wasn't a 100% fully independent nation-state. The British Parliament had limited authority to legislate on behalf of Australia, and Queen Elizabeth II was Australia's head of state too and had constitutional authority there. Of course, she wasn't able to personally attend all of the countries she ruled, and so in her stead sat the Governor-General. And the Governor-General, in essence, acted as the Prime Minister's sort of boss and was responsible for rubber-stamping any legislation and calling elections. Anyway, from 1949 to 1972, Australia had been governed by a coalition of Conservative parties. This was until they were defeated by the Labour Party and its leader, Gough Whitlam, became the Prime Minister. Now, becoming Prime Minister depended on controlling Australia's House of Representatives, but not its Senate, the balance of which sat on a knife edge. But the Senate also had to approve legislation for it to be passed. Now, Whitlam had been elected on a manifesto with increased spending, withdrawing from the Vietnam War and centralising power, which did not sit well with the Conservatives in the Senate. Whitlam also wished to investigate the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, since they had previously spied on his party. He had them raided in 1973 and demanded a list of all CIA operatives in Australia. And soon after this, he publicly accused numerous people in positions of power of being American spies as well. And the Americans did not respond well to this and made it clear that if Whitlam continued down this road, the US would be forced to make adjustments. After this, things got much better for Whitlam, and by better, I mean worse, because recession. Whitlam called for an election in 1974, and whilst he won the House, he lost the Senate, meaning more deadlock and no more spending. Not to worry though, because foreigners exist, and Whitlam had the authority to borrow money through Australia's Loan Council without the Senate's approval. Whitlam's government didn't tell the Loans Council though, and secretly tried to borrow money from Saudi Arabia. This was leaked, and so the politicians involved did something clever. They lied. And when these lies became public, they were promptly sacked and Whitlam's reputation was damaged. And to further add insult to injury, a Labour Party senator resigned and was replaced against convention by a Conservative, meaning for Whitlam he had zero chance of getting anything through the Senate anymore. Despite this though, Whitlam refused to resign or give his consent to new elections, which the Governor-General needed to call them. And this is where the crisis begins in earnest. The Governor-General of Australia at this time was a man called John Kerr, a close friend of Whitlam's who was deeply concerned about the deadlock in government. And so Kerr came up with a brilliant solution. He fired Whitlam and appointed the leader of the opposition, Malcolm Fraser, as Prime Minister in his stead. The problem with this was that at the time it wasn't exactly clear whether or not Kerr had the authority to do this. Kerr had been in contact with Buckingham Palace to discuss what he was and wasn't able to do, and those at the palace reassured him that he had the authority to dismiss the Prime Minister and that if he wanted to do so, he would need to do so quickly, because with a single letter, Whitlam could have Kerr removed by the Queen. The problem with this is that in Australian politics, the Queen is supposed to be neutral in all affairs, and by nudging Kerr in one direction, she would have breached that precedent, which is the issue with this entire crisis. Legally, everything was above board, but in terms of established precedent, which laid the foundation of trust in the Australian political system, everything was thrown out the window. Irrespective of any of this, Whitlam was removed, and those who supported the Labour Party were furious. And Whitlam was quick to point out Kerr's historic ties with the CIA and the intelligence community in general, whereas the Conservatives were happy that the government deadlock seemed to be coming to an end. And in the election that followed the crisis, the Conservative coalition won a resounding victory with control of both houses.